Okay, so here we are with section 1.1, day 2. So it's just a continuation of what we already talked about, more review of some things that you've probably seen before. First thing we're going to talk about is domain. A domain is the set of all possible x values for a relation or function. Other names that you might have heard used for the domain are maybe the input values, the independent variable, and the big one is it's the x's. Now the range is the set of all possible y values for a relation or function. So other names for those would be output values, dependent variables, or more commonly, the y's. There's two ways to represent the domain and range of a function. We can use interval notation. We can also use something called set builder notation. We're going to primarily use interval notation, but we will do a little bit of set builder, so I'm going to write down an example for you. Interval notation looks like this. This is just a random example. You've seen it before. It means that our domain or range would go from negative infinity all the way to positive 7, and it would include positive 7 because it has the bracket on it. The set builder way to write the same thing would be to write x such that x is less than or equal to 7, and x is an element of the real number set. So we're going to mostly stick with interval notation, but just don't be afraid to tackle a set builder problem if you see one. Recall that brackets mean greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. A parentheses means it's not equal to. And we always use a parentheses for positive and negative infinity because you're never going to be able to equal it, so you're always just getting closer and closer to it. So we use the parentheses. So real quick examples, write the following in interval notation. Create a number line if needed. I'm going to create a number line for all of them just so you can see what it looks like. So it says right here that our x value is less than or equal to 3. So that means it's equal to 3 because that's what less than or equal to means. And it's going to be everything less than. So that is what's going on here. Now the interval notation, the way you would write that is from negative infinity to positive 3 bracket. Let's go over to x is greater than 5. So we look at a little number line, and I always just use 0 and the number I actually care about. I don't care what's happening at 4, I don't care what's happening at 6, I care what's happening at 5 because 5 is the number for my problem. So we say x is greater than 5. So it's everything past 5. We got that. But it's not 5. So we put an opening there, we put a hole there. And so the way we would write that is we start at 5, but we don't equal 5, and we go all the way to positive infinity. So that's our interval notation. Negative 1 is less than x is less than or equal to 3. That's a fancy way of saying x is between negative 1 and 3. So when you draw the number line, it's not any different than the number lines we've done before. It was 0, a 3, negative 1. X is everything between these two. We just have to decide do they get circles or shaded in circles. So negative 1 is not equal to, 3 is equal to, and x is everything in between there. So our interval notation, we would say that we start at negative 1 but don't include negative 1, and we go all the way to positive 3. So negative 1 to 3 is our domain. Keep practicing here. Negative 4 to positive 7. I'm going to quit doing the number lines now, and I'm just going to write them out. So negative 4 to 7. So bracket, parentheses. X is greater than 5, and x is less than or equal to negative 2. We'll do a quick number line just to refresh everybody on this. So 0, 5, negative 2. So x is greater than 5, but not equal to. X is less than or equal to -2. So our interval notation, we would say that we start at -infinity, and we continue on to -2, which we include, and then we start back up at 5, but not include 5, and continue all the way to positive infinity. The symbol that goes in between these two is a big U shape, which stands for union. You've probably seen that before. Last one we're going to look at is all real numbers, and I'll do the number line for that just because it's pretty easy. So I have 0, and all real numbers means that it includes the entire number line. So that's going to go from -infinity to positive infinity. Okay, so just looking at this table, this gives you kind of a quick refresher of the interval notation. I know it's pretty blurry on the screen. I think your paper copy is a little bit better, but just remember the equal sign, less than or equal to, gets a bracket. Greater than or equal to, it's going to get a bracket. It's greater than, it's going to go to infinity. If it's less than, it's going to go to -infinity. Kind of review this table and see if you have any questions. We're going to practice real quick with domain and range. I know these are things that you remember, but we're going to cover it anyways. Remember, domain is the x's, range is the y's. So for each of these, we're going to write down the domain and the range. So let's go to example A. We're going to write down the domain. So the domain, well, is the x value. So the lowest x value I see all the way to the edge of the graph, and I see these arrows, so that means it's starting at -infinity. And it goes all the way to right here, where the x value, remember all we care about is the x's, the x value here is 0, but it equals 0. So we get a bracket. Now we're going to do the range. The range is whatever the highest value it goes to. Now, the highest it goes is right here, but again, that arrow lets me know that this thing is just going to keep on going. So it's going to go up to positive infinity on the y-axis. And the same, it's going to keep on going down to -infinity on the y-axis as well. So our range is going to be -infinity to positive infinity. No brackets, just parentheses. Example B, our domain goes from right here to right here on the x-axis. So our domain is very specific. It goes from 1, 2, 3, -3, 1, 2, 3, to +3. And that's our domain. And our range does the same thing. It goes from this point to this point. And our graph doesn't go any higher or lower than these 2 points. So it begins always, remember we always start at the lowest point on the range. So 1, 2, 3. Range is -3, 1, 2, 3, to +3 as well. And that should hopefully make sense to you. We got a circle, it's centered at 0, 0. It has a radius of 3. So in any direction, we're only ever going to get to go 3. So hopefully that makes a little connection for you. All right, this is called a piecewise function. This is a function that one part of it does one thing, and then when the x values get past a certain point, it does something different. And we're going to work with these later in the year, but for now, let's just establish what the domain is of this thing. So the domain starts right here. And remember, you can see our scale here. Each one of these squares is 2. So this is -2, -4. So the domain, this thing starts at -4, but it doesn't include -4 because there's a circle there. And it goes all the way to +2, right? +2 on the x-axis, but it doesn't include +2. And then it keeps going, right? It keeps going on to infinity. But we got to take this +2 out. So the way we do that is we say -4 to 2, everything was good. Then we got to -2 and we stopped. We didn't go past it. Then we unioned with another set, And it started up at 2, and it continued on to infinity. So that's how we would write the domain of this function. And the range is going to be very similar. The range is going to go from its lowest point, which we see with this arrow down here, that's negative infinity, to its highest point. So as we start to move up the y-axis, we see we're good here. We have values here, we have values here, and we get up to this point right here. That's -2. So we stop at -2. We don't include -2. And then we're going to union with the next time we have y values. So we go up, no y values, no y values, and we get to here. And the only y values we have for this whole piece right here are 6. And not only is it 6, it's exactly 6. So we put a bracket around it, meaning that it's exactly 6 and nothing else. Now we're going to do the last one. Okay, we see it starts right here. So its domain goes from here to infinity. So our domain is -8, includes -8 because it's bubbled in, to infinity. And our range, well, we start at the lowest point on the graph, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, -10. And it goes all the way up to also infinity, going up, because that's what the arrows do. So that's a quick refresher on domain and range. Write down any questions you have, and we'll talk about it tomorrow.